Hello. That t-shirt I wore the last video obviously caused a bit of a fuss. So this time I decided, I might as well wear my Graniopteryx t-shirt. I hope you find that a lot less frightening. Sorry, I'm resting my hands on a drawer here and it's moving a bit. I thought perhaps, now my last video I talked about the demise of the EU, which I reckon is unable to deal with current events around the COVID-19 virus. I thought maybe I could explain to you what objections I have to the EU and why I would be, if I am in good health or even alive, very much happy to dance on the EU's grave. First of all, it's not democratic. That's obvious. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail. We all know that. Even the people in the EU admit that it's a bureaucracy, not a democracy. That's the first thing. The second thing, but really the two main objections I have beside that are that it's based on a set of lies. And the second is that it's based on a political model that's nearly 200 years out of date. So let's start with the lie. When anything begins with a lie, that should disqualify it in every way from any reality. And the EU is one of the biggest lies that have been perpetrated on a whole set of populations for the past 150 years. It was based, to begin with, not on a lie, but on an idea first mooted by Count Richard, Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi. A lot of people talk about the Kalergi plan as if this was some sort of conspiracy. It wasn't. Kalergi saw the terrible effects of European wars, and that prompted him to start what he called the Pan-European movement in the 1920s. And it was a reasonable idea at the time, and he never made any secret of his aims of a unified Europe. The Pan-European organization, by the way, has always been separate from the general political movement, which we call the EU. Even Winston Churchill thought many of its aims were sound, but he never envisaged, for instance, that Britain should become a part of it. Based upon this philosophical idea, the European Union started out as what was supposed to be a trade organization, and it was called the European Coal and Steel Community, and it was established in 1951 after a speech by the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. His idea was that if Europe collaborated in making coal and steel, which he thought of as the basic materials of the tools for war, then they wouldn't be able to make war against each other because, they wouldn't be able to make the tanks. And this brings me to the second of my objections to the EU, and that is its built-in obsolescence. But I'll get back to that in a few moments. The formation of the European Coal and Steel Community was actually encouraged by George C. Marshall, the American Secretary of State. At the time, America, they saw such a collaboration as a way of rebuilding Europe. Britain then joined the EEC, the European Economic Community, in 1971. And this is where the lies, so far as I'm concerned, where the lies came in, from the point of view of Britain, at any rate. Because before we joined, a report composed by some office in the civil service correctly predicted that the EEC would eventually take over all British legislative mechanisms, and that eventually the British government would wither away and all power would pass to Brussels. That was actually on the cards. At this point, Edward Heath's government clamped down on the news of this report and declared it, in effect, a state secret. Now, one of the reasons, I think Heath was a very bad prime minister, and you could make a case for him being actually a traitor, I think. But you have to understand the situation at the time. Britain was in a state of civil war at the time. It was racked by industrial action, by strikes, and the sort of communist infiltration of means of production, all very much encouraged by the Russian government, I might say, various other communist governments. So I think it's possible that Heath saw this as a way of protecting Britain from this communist takeover that he probably thought was going to happen. I mean, that is the most charitable interpretation I can put on what he was doing there. I actually can't say for sure what his motives were. I'm just saying it might not have been simple. It could have been something to do with the sort of strikes. I mean, nothing like that stopped until Margaret Thatcher came in with very strong-arm tactics. She managed to stop it, but Heath wasn't up to that sort of job. Anyway, this was a state secret, and all government offices were instructed not to let the cat out of the bag and to keep that secret until, and they were very aware of this, until Britain had become so interwoven with the European Union that it would be impossible to leave. You see what sort of a narrow escape we've had here. The whole sorry mess is contained in a recently declassified document called document FC0 or FCO30/1048. After that, the European Union went through various treaties, one after the other, which gave them more and more power in little bits, so that you didn't really notice it until the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, signed by the British government under the administration of John Major. Mrs. Thatcher said she would not have signed such a treaty, and she was universally pilloried as a silly old fool by almost all the intellectuals, media types and political pundits that got any voice in the general discourse. Now, she'd made a speech, she could see where things were going. She made a speech in Bruges in 1988 in which she pointed out the dangers of the steadily bloating European Union. And a year later, a think tank got started called the Bruges Group, which kept alive the idea of leaving the EU. They had frequent meetings and speakers. I attended some of them. And this was going on through all the years of the 1990s and the early 2000s, when such views were not fashionable. I'm proud to say I'm still on their mailing list. Now, let's get to so that's the political, the philosophical thing behind it, the lie behind the story that was being sold to the British public. Now let's get to the obsolescence. And it comes out of the general philosophical and historical background of the two main drivers of the EU, France and Germany. Most people don't realise that in the 19th century, France wasn't one country. It had a whole lot of mini languages, dialects and vernaculars in many of the regions, and the schools were all taught in these various languages. It wasn't until 1880 that the Third Republic clamped down on all of this messy disparity and forced schools to teach in French right across the country. And they went so far as to stop children speaking in their own vernacular in the school playgrounds. There was even, and this didn't work quite so well, but there was a determined effort to destroy Breton, an ancient language of the area of Brittany. It predates French itself. And it was against this background of a deliberate ironing out of regional differences that France approached the construction of the common market. That was in the French mind. At the same time, Germany was going through a similar process. But as is the usual case, in Germany, it was going to be more extreme. As late as the 19th century, the territory we now call Germany was a mess of small principalities and duchies and mini-states, and each one administering its own borders. So if you wanted to transport goods from Bavaria in the south to Schleswig-Holstein in the north, you end up paying customs duties to about 5 states in between. I'm not being accurate here. I haven't counted them. It was a mess, and it made trade and commerce and communications very difficult. So in 1871, Germany was finally unified under Otto von Bismarck after a series of what you might call rather brutal moves. Belgium also had been unified during the 19th century, although somewhat earlier. It was a mixture of several duchies, and they all coalesced in 1830. The point is that the Europeans had this idea that unification, even unification at the point of a bayonet, was a good idea. It was a 19th century political idea, and the originators of the European Union were carrying out that idea forward into the 20th century and then into the 21st century. And apart from the fact that it was a political idea, it was also a trade idea. It had its beginnings in 19th century practices. Remember, in the 19th century, you shifted everything by train or road in inefficient cars or, donkey carts, sometimes by steamship, but nothing faster. It wasn't just steel and coal, was it? You even shifted ideas by train and road in the form of books and magazines. So, of course, it made sense to think of having a coordinated system in Europe where, as happened in Germany, you can move stuff seamlessly from one end of Europe to another. The idea that traders would be shifting stuff by air in giant planes wasn't in their wildest dreams. And the idea that information and remote printing would be transferred to the other side of the world in seconds by internet would have been the ravings of a lunatic. So the common market got started in the 1950s, but the people who started it were born in the 1880s maybe. And they had those 19th century ideas, and indeed, even in the 1950s, they could still consider that the tools of war were going to be coal and steel to the end of all eternity. It wouldn't have occurred to anyone that the tools of war would depend not upon how many men could stoke a boiler, but how many of them would be working on a computer program that would cause a steel foundry 2,000 miles away to blow up on its own, or people working in a laboratory to create a virus that could destroy the economy of the entire world without firing a single shot. The EU isn't prepared for that. because it's a 19th century establishment based on steam trains and hand-cranked telephones, not on jumbo jets and the internet. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.